Hi, welcome everyone. I'm Duane, and I'll be the host for today's conversation, which is part of a series that has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities as part of their initiative on the dangers and opportunities of technology. And this particular series was inspired by the way that artificial intelligence is pictured either as a slave or the opposite story, that we are enslaved by them, as it shows up in the stories we tell and the stories we are drawn to hearing about artificial intelligence in popular culture. From the Terminator's futuristic hellscape, where humans are enslaved by Skynet, a super AI created by Cyberdyne Systems, or in The Matrix. There is also, of course, popular culture that imagines a chummier relationship with a chatbot that becomes our friends. But the more common one is narratives of slavery and subjugation that have dominated storytelling about a possible future among social robots, including The Matrix, The Terminator, and even more recent films like The Creator, in which enslaved artificial intelligence rise up, and of course the Blade Runner franchise. And in all of these cases, either we are enslaving the bots or we are being enslaved by them. And we have personally been really interested in how metaphors of slavery get deployed and what that language and that metaphor and that storytelling means for how we imagine power, sovereignty, relationships, labor, and even love. Slavery has been deployed as a metaphor for hundreds of years in American history, as a stand-in always for something else, even when, of course, for the hundreds of years in which the United States had legal slavery, it actually also defined an everyday reality. In the Revolutionary War, American colonists identified themselves as slaves to make the case that what England was doing was immoral. The English, for their part, were quick to point out the irony that those who were lamenting their colonial status were themselves slaveholders. Samuel Johnson asked at the start of the Revolution, quote, "How is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes?" End quote. It seemed that the more pressing the issue of chattel slavery itself became on the national stage, the more ways it showed up in metaphors. Another example, Abraham Lincoln himself, right, the great emancipator, often referred to alcoholics as slaves. And many other temperance tracts and other reform tracts made similar equivalences. Slavery would be used to describe many, many other things. The 13th Amendment, which is the amendment which outlawed slavery, has been applied in court cases involving the labor of sailors, of child abuse, and of domestic violence. So, as part of our conversation today, we'll be asking, what do we do when not only the stories we tell about artificial intelligence invoke slavery, but when that metaphor is used by experts who are actually working with it, right? It's one thing if it's happening in the Matrix. It's another thing, I think, when futurists, computer scientists, programmers are using these metaphors. And in truth, many people who are working with developing AI believe that there is a real danger that artificial intelligences will enslave and perhaps even destroy humanity. For instance, Stuart Russell, co-author of a leading textbook on AI, is, in his own words, quote, "publicly committed to the view that his own field of research poses a potential risk to his own species." Jeremy Peckham, a computer scientist and Silicon Valley entrepreneur, has written a quite popular book about AI called, literally, Masters and Slaves, AI and the Future of Humanity. A very famous article written by a professor of ethics and technology insisted in its very title that robots should be slaves. So using slavery to describe our relationship with artificial intelligence is no idle metaphor. I, as an English professor, would argue that no metaphor invoking slavery is ever idle, but we see here that the structure of slavery continues to have a hold on our imagination that emerges in both fantasy and arguably in policy aimed at our future with artificial intelligence. So I've got a wonderful person here to talk to me about it, to think about some of these questions and some of these metaphors. So I will just go ahead and introduce you. Austin has been waiting very patiently as I got through my little spiel. Austin Choi-Fitzpatrick is a professor at the University of San Diego's Kroc School of Peace Studies and an associate provost of academic strategy and growth at the University of San Diego. He is a co-director of the Gilder Lehrman Center Working Group on the Future of Slavery and Emancipation at Yale University and an affiliate at the Aspen Institute. He also serves as faculty director of the Social Innovation Institute at the University of San Diego, the director of Social Innovation Master's Program at the Kroc School, and vice president of the Arts Build Collective. Among his recent publications, Wicked Problems explores the importance of taking action in challenging times. His book, What Slave Owners Think, drew on 15 years of work in the 21st century anti-slavery movement to examine the exploitative labor imposed on men, women, and children in rural India to ask how contemporary slaveholders rationalized the subjugation of other human beings. And more recently, his article, which I'm very excited to talk a little bit more about, The Future of Human Rights, asks us to think about the multiple forces, I think technology among them, that might change what we imagine human means and what we imagine rights might look like in the future. I've already said, my name is Anna Mae Duane. I co-direct the Gilder Lehrman Center's Future of Slavery and Emancipation working group. And so we both want to thank David Blight and the GLC for bringing us together, for making this conversation possible, as well as Yale and, of course, the National Endowment of the Humanities. Okay, so let's dig in. I gave a lot to think about.
Let's do this.
Let's do it. Let's figure out the future. And AI and ourselves. Ready?
I'm ready. We're all ready, aren't we? We're already here.
So I'm going to back up and think about what's being evoked when slavery is being used, as I said, both in sort of popular culture, by legal scholars, by programmers themselves, and by looking a little bit to the past, which you have studied the history of human rights, thinking about what's going on in the present, and something we've been thinking about together, right? How this might map on to the future, how sort of these frameworks that we've been working with will shape, break, enable different ways of engaging with technology, perhaps for good or to our detriment, right? Its dangers and opportunities. I wanted to just throw some quotes at you, which I've already done, but these are like some really interesting ones that are to really drill down on what is happening when people are referring to AI as slaves. I mean, one of the things I've been saying for a while is we often throw away the slavery metaphor as like it's just sloppy, it's disrespectful, it just means bad. But I think it really matters what aspect of slavery is being evoked in that metaphor. And what it means for whatever we're applying that metaphor to. So just for instance, so in that article I've already referenced, because the title is just so shocking to me, Robots Should Be Slaves, which is by Joanna Bryson. She says, when I say robots should be slaves, I by no means mean robots should be people you own. What I mean to say is robots should be servants you own. And so she wants to make that distinction between people and servants. And then she notes that, oh, yes, I am using slavery and, it's a word that has negative beliefs, but give it a chance, basically. She says our culture has, with good reason, become extremely defensive against actions and beliefs associated with such dehumanization that happens with slavery. But she pushes us to ask, surely dehumanization is only wrong when it's applied to someone who's human. And then I just wanted to throw one more at you, which is Andrew Katz, who's an expert in technology, law, and intellectual property. And he wants us to use sort of legal structures of slavery going back to ancient times to create a legal framework for dealing with AI. And so he, again, sort of makes an apology for the analogy, but says, no, slavery is the way we should think about this. He says the analogy is not a perfect one, but comparison may be instructive. Like a slave, an autonomous agent has no rights or duties itself. Like a slave, it is capable of making decisions that will affect the rights and, in later law, the liabilities of the master. By facilitating commercial transactions, autonomous agents have the ability to increase market efficiency. Like a slave, an autonomous agent is capable of doing harm. And there I think he's talking about, so when we have bots making purchases on the stock market or something, how are we going to protect ourselves from these agents that are making purchases but might also go awry? And he's like, slavery has a format for that. So I just want to throw those out at you and think about, as a scholar of slavery, what do you make of these two examples and some of the other ones I've thrown out? Why are we going to this metaphor? Or what strikes you about the way this metaphor is being used in these by these folks who are, not scholars of slavery, but who are instead trying to think about the future? Why go to the past?
Yeah, so there's a lot in there.
Yeah.
And two things I would flag most immediately is that, and this is just recapping from the top where you started, slavery is invoked both as a metaphor, and then we can ask the question: what is it pointing towards?
Mm-hmm.
What's it trying to signify? And then also as an actual analogy rooted in a political economy. We can actually ask questions like, will things that should have rights going to have their rights denied? And so one of these is a kind of way of thinking about. It's language that comes from rights and movements and is meant to galvanize, as opposed to a real thoroughgoing analysis of what actually is. So, for example, you mentioned Bryson's robots should be slaves. This is an argument about where it is that technological innovation should go. Mm-hmm. If we have the capacity to develop a kind of new category of helpers that work alongside humans, then do we allow our research and our development and our innovation to go in such a way that they are given sentience or are allowed to manifest or discover sentience? Mm-hmm. Or are they sort of truncated and kept at the level of a tool? Nobody ever asks, is a hammer a slave? Because a hammer has no additional capacity that we're aware of to be something other than an extension of human will. And we're unclear right now, both in terms of where, let's just say, artificial minds and artificial bodies, we're unclear where that is headed. Yeah. And so we're in the earliest stages of asking questions like, should we see how far we can take this? Or should we put some limits on it and only take it so far? And someone like Bryson's argument is we should only take it so far. And we should stop at the point where we've developed a really good hammer today. So sort of use that as an analogy. And we should, in other words, it's just a tool for the human agent. Right. So then why use the language slave? And
right,
it's
and
to be
and
not tool. Yeah, and so Bryson could have just as easily said robots should be tools, and robots should be essentially like most cars were about 10 years ago, which is they don't tell you what to do when you get too close to the side of the road and it goes, I have a new car, and it tells me when I'm too close to the little line. My steering wheel vibrates. I don't like that feedback. It's made me a less safe driver. But anyway, we can talk about that later. But the question is, do we want our cars to talk back to us? No, we want our cars to just be a tool. Let's just say we have that argument. Then maybe Bryson is arguing the same thing should be true of robots. And robots here is like shorthand for, artificial intelligence and robotics. Different folks are doing different work. Some folks are doing similar work that just has different labels on it. Some people say robots and they kind of mean minds. They mean agency, the ability to act in the world in an embodied way. And other folks, when they say artificial intelligence, recognize that an intellectual agent to exercise agency might need some way of being embodied in the world in the form of some sort of corporal embodied stuff like a body, or maybe they're just going to be doing trading on the stock market. But I'll stop here and toss it back to you. But the thing that catches my eye is, when is it that slave is being used euphemistically in order to indicate toolness? In a way of speaking. And when is it actual language that says something that has agents, that should have agency, that should have freedom, is having that thing denied? And I say something and should, and there's a lot that gets really squishy, because at the same time we're having this conversation, there's a separate conversation about personhood. Yep. and about extending personhood. So we can like spin around in our chairs and put on different hats and have a whole conversation about the sort of human rights and rights regimes have been advanced recently through extending personhood to non-human persons. So should great apes have personhood? Should a river have personhood? I was speaking with a colleague yesterday who said, I'm really, really worried about this particular extractive industry in this particular community. I wonder if we can grant rights to that microecology, that space, and so that its rights won't be violated by this extractive industry. So at one moment, personhood is shifting from humans to humans, and at the same time, we're having conversations about, let's just call it agency, the ability to act purposefully in the world. That conversation is also changing and evolving. And we haven't really yet had serious accounts where these things start to come together and then we can have debates, conversations, arguments, disagreements at that overlap, that juncture.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. Exactly, that's one of the places I want to go is thinking about how this argument about personhood and on what axis we want to grant it. Is it about intellect? Is it about embodiment? Is it about feeling? Is it about suffering? And again, like all of these arguments have been used in the past to grant enslaved people personhood. And so how is that going to get mixed up? How are we going to draw from that? And I do think, I buy the tools argument, but I'm also like so intrigued that, when she says they shouldn't be people we own, but they're servants we own. But our servants are people, that we can't seem to help ourselves. And I do think it is partly about this anxiety about, well, it's not a car, right? We don't quite know at what point, right? And I think it does matter, and that's actually what I want to sort of jump into next, is if and when there's superior capacity for intellect, for reason, which I'm going to sort of dig into
like
the past.
Superintelligence. I mean, there's a sort of Bostrom superintelligence.
Then in the past, that's who gets to be a person, right? If we're thinking, so actually, I'm going to just back up but that's exactly what I'm thinking about, right? The mind-body binary. And so, this is the Gilder Lehrman Center, so we're going to have to talk about Frederick Douglass a little bit because he's kind of the patron saint of the Gilder Lehrman Center. But, one argument in sort of American 19th century abolitionism that Frederick Douglass, of course, makes beautifully is that he should not be enslaved because he can write an incredible book, he can reason with his enslavers, that there's no difference, right? Part of the argument was that people who were enslaved couldn't govern themselves, didn't have the intellect to do so. And Frederick Douglass, for instance, the famous passage, when I teach Frederick Douglass, like I always ask the students to sort of say, at what moment does he no longer become a slave? And there's a few of them, right? He announces himself as not a slave when he fights Covey. But another moment in which he sort of says, this is the moment that sort of, you see when a slave becomes a man. That's the language he uses. But one of those sort of like aha moments is when he sort of gets a hold of the Columbian orator. And he reads a debate, and I'll just sort of quote from it really briefly. But it's a debate between a slave and a master. This is his language. And after the whole argument, the master was vanquished at every turn in the argument, and seeing himself to be vanquished, he generously and meekly emancipates the slave with best wishes for his prosperity, which is, of course, the ideal situation. But it is scarcely necessary to say, and this is Douglass again, that a dialogue with such an origin and such an ending read when the fact of my being a slave was a constant burden of grief, powerfully affected me, and I could not help feeling that the day might come when the well-directed answers made by the slave to the master, in this instance, would find their counterpart in itself. So that's like if you can speak well enough, if you are intellectual enough, if you can convince your enslaver of the worth of your argument, then you should be a person, or at least not a slave. And so that's what I'm wondering. Both, I want to think about like the issues with that as an argument for personhood or enslavement. and both sort of how it was powerful in the past, but also some critiques of it, or like who does it leave out? But also, I want to sort of, after we sort of unpack that a little bit, be thinking about, okay, well, what happens if we stick with that, or if that's one of the metrics when we like face a future in which we are not the smartest person on the block. So I guess I'll start just by letting you jump in. And actually, I want to quote you because one of the places you think about this, and you're worried about how, like, you know, in the future, both AI but also human enhancements. And you talk about biological and medical breakthroughs focused on enhancing humans who can afford it. And it might also result in systems or situations where other humans are downgraded in order to better serve the powerful. So we have the question of, like, what is intellect doing? You've already written really eloquently about, like, okay, we're thinking here about us versus AI as it's being framed in the slavery debate, but there's also, like, what happens among ourselves if we're going to keep going by intellect. So I just toss it to you. What are your thoughts about just a response to that quote? I think let's just jump in.
There's a lot going on here, a lot to respond to.
I know.
I'll say two things really quickly. Two things I think. This is a very old conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's recognized as much as it should be. It's not sort of problematized, I think, as much as it should be, but a debate in political philosophy about the origins of rights, individual rights. And that conversation has tended to ask whether or not there are natural rights, or are these things we've sort of all gotten together and collectively hallucinated and then enforced through our institutions. And then you get a bit more nuanced debates, for example, between Brian S. Turner. This is not actually a debate, but two different perspectives. Brian S. Turner says we actually have rights because we're embodied, and our idea of our rights comes from the fact that we are, we're corporal, and we feel pain, and it's best to have, for example, rights regimes, whether they're in laws or norms or what have you, that protect our bodies, for example, or our minds from being harmed. And so we can better understand what should be if we see what actually is, right? This is I don't know if Turner's explicitly meaning to be Aristotelian here, but this is like a long legacy here. And there's a separate conversation that is really rooted in the mind, this idea that if we think, therefore we are, and existence, and this is the deep philosophy for Frederick Douglass's argument, whether he realized it in that first moment when he made it or not, is this sense that I can think, and we're having this conversation, so am I not a man? And that has led to this pitting of ideas and the mind versus embodiment and the body as these two different alternatives to, let's say, natural law or to divine ordination or some sort. Now, and then I'm saying all this because the philosopher Martha Nussbaum has come along and said, actually, can I hold up? Gents, these have been men having these conversations. Can we have a quick sidebar? What happens when a human is born without a brain? And so there's essentially a whole person here missing the cognitive capacity. And so is that a person? And so, when I say that, our minds instantly go to sort of like the medical moment and the human moment. But if we kind of stay at the level of philosophy just for a second and ask, what's going on here? Is that a person that has the rights of a person? And the answer is yes. So Nussbaum says then, well, if it's not in the mind, right, then where is it? And this is really a shot to the sort of Descartesian folks that say that it's if we have this capacity to reason. And I say all that, that's a kind of like a long, boring philosophy lecture, but I say all that because podcast. those two or three different ways of thinking. Is it the mind, the body, or something else? And is it from God, or is it from our decisions together to build the world in a certain way? We've been able to coast for somewhere, depending on how you account, 20, 70, or about 200 years on some of those ideas. But the rise of artificial minds and artificial bodies puts all of that in play again. not as philosophy, but as like political economy, not as like abstract stuff, but as rules and laws and podcast conversations and real decisions that developers need to make, whose incentives are really aligned with economic gain and scientific breakthrough, and not with philosophical exploration. So I say all that to say that we're in this moment where these big philosophical questions are getting operationalized as real technical problems and debates by engineers who are in many cases not trained in or aware of or maybe even interested in some of those implications. So we've got the Boffins, who you just mentioned, these sort of people who, like, Russell Stewart and others, who are Nick Bostrom, asking these questions from philosophy, but less often from inside the corridors, the labs of Silicon Valley, because those interest, that inertia, and their training is just different. They tend to be engineers, let's say, instead of political science or philosophers. So that brings us to this like really, really strange moment that we're in. And what we do with that, I think, is an open question.
Right. No, I think that's, and I think maybe even you and I fall on different, I mean, you mentioned Nussbaum, and she's like in my list of quotes as well too. Because, I mean, for me, and again, thinking about, and I think you're right, and this is like one of the arguments of the podcast in the series, is that we are at a detriment when people who are using slavery either as a metaphor, as an analogy, as like, no, let's use the legal structure of slavery because we can totally aren't thinking about these sort of past arguments, these long philosophical and legal and moral arguments about, okay, when does a person get to govern themselves? When does a person deserve rights? And Martha Nussbaum, just to sort of unpack her a little bit more, because I think she's so important on this, for her, one of the things as someone who has always been interested in how children show up in rights conversations, in Frontiers of Justice, she talks about developing countries and disabilities, but children, I looked, they don't really show up. I think they're another place we're really not sure, like, okay, at what point, if you think about Locke and Rousseau, it's reason. It's not the body, right? Children are all body. And so I just think, as an aside, that's a really interesting place where this, our own moment, we still have not quite figured out for actual people, never mind other kinds of minds. But I do sort of think about it the way that the argument of reason already leaves people out. And then, so for Douglas, and anyone who teaches Douglas or teaches, he's an incredible character and sort of exemplar, but he's also brilliant. He's also strong. He's also young. He's also a man. So his arguments for freedom, or what makes you not a slave, can apply to everyone. If you think of women and children who are, because of their bodies, considered incapable of reason. So, I mean, I just think it leads to really interesting questions about, okay, well, what happens when our bodies are too dependent? All of our bodies are too dependent to match up to the kind of, if we're thinking of just computing power, which I don't know if that's reducing reason. I'm sure it is. But if it's just about processing information and making arguments really quickly that will appeal to a wide bunch of audiences, we're already behind.
So I agree. And I would like to say something else, which is that I think the conversation, the thing I said a minute ago is kind of, I've written about this, the way I've been thinking about this, which is around the mind-body sort of tension. And
can you say where that is so we can put it in our...
Oh, it's the Journal of the piece in the Journal of Human Rights.
Yes, the Future of Human Rights, yes.
So the thing that you touched on in your earlier question from me, which I didn't pick back up, but now I think is the right time for, is that, well, can you meet me, where's the audience? Can you meet me on camera too? I'm a sociologist, and I'm going to say something that I don't actually know if this is where things are going to go. What do I know? Okay,
write it down.
So my general sense is that we've had this conversation as if it is artificial minds and artificial bodies, robots and AI, v humans. And somehow the question is like, and you invoked this earlier, we get this idea of, is it going to be, are the Terminators are coming and will they be our servants, a la robots should be slaves, Bryson, or will they be our overlords in some way? And then in other words, will they be the slaves or will we be the slaves? To go back to the top, to the framing, the metaphor that you started us out with. And I think it's just as likely, perhaps, and this is why I did my caveat to camera 2, it's just as likely, put an asterisk here because I don't know what I'm talking about, it's just as likely that we use about 10% of our brains. The wetware we've got between our ears is so fundamentally powerful in ways that we don't quite understand. We're having huge sort of energy challenges, raw material challenges tied to just pure compute when it comes to the tech stack. Just getting the right kind of processors, and that's why NVIDIA's stock is through the roof, just getting the kind of like tech stack dialed in so that when you do a search in ChatGPT, it can come back and sound a little bit smarter than Google. And we don't have that computationally figured out. And I think probably the fastest processor we could be running right now, if we knew more about how it worked and if we could get it out of our domes, is our brain. And so I think it's far less likely that it's humans v. robots. I think it's more likely that what we end up doing is finding very expensive but highly efficient and powerful ways of connecting our minds with additional compute. And then what we actually have is upcycled or sort of upskilled humans. Right. And so this leads then to whole other conversations about whether or not my insurance plan covers the neural upload to sort of Neuralink and by Neuralink to Starlink, and then whether or not I'm paying my subscription fees to Musk in order for my mind to have this sort of computational pull at a planetary level that sort of network affords. Now, I'm making all that up, but that then suggests that the real deep questions are, how do we keep civil society together? How do we keep a shared sense of community together when inequality, which is already hockey sticking upward and to the right, when that actually gets accelerated by not just, our wealth and differences in capacity, et cetera, but by raw intellectual horsepower, brains can just do much more. We have a huge variation in what our brains can do. And I'll say one thing, then I'll stop and I'll toss it back to you. I saw last week a gentleman who only is mobile thanks to the help of an exoskeleton. Mm-hmm. The company that built the exoskeleton is no longer supporting the software or the tech. And so that's interesting. So if I'm paying licensing fees to a company that helps my brain go faster and I'm halfway through the LSAT and then I run out of money, then what happens? I mean, like, what happens there? And all of a sudden when I say that, sorry, I just made that up. But when I say that we're not in robots are coming for our jobs and we're not in artificial intelligence is going to say they're people, they're human, and we're going to have to listen or we don't, and then we're going to have to fight. And, are they better at that than us? I mean, there's all that sort of doom and gloom, sort of stuff. It actually is a lot simpler. It's an older story and it might be more terrifying, which is it might just be us. No,
I think that's so fascinating. I just want to sort of recap and sort of think through, because, when I was thinking about this conversation and you've already alluded to it, right, I was thinking about the mind-body polarity, which I think is one, especially when we're thinking about older arguments about what makes a person and slavery, like, where is it because I feel compassion for you, or is it because you can out-argue me? But what you're saying, which I think is really, of course, brilliant because you're saying it, it's true, that it's also about wealth and oppression. And so one reason why, the go-to for this metaphor is that because that's how we always treat any divisions of power, is that someone is going to dominate and someone is going to be subjugated. So if we've got this new set of tools that we're not sure about where they're going to, what kind of demands they're going to make, that's just, we're going to slot them into those two. And that's why it makes so much sense in the Terminator and the Blade Runner, and it resonates with all of us because that's what we do as human beings. But also the question of wealth that you're pointing out here. And I'm just thinking of, and you can, I'm sure, quote this verbatim, which I cannot, but one of the definitions of modern slavery, the Harvard Bellagio definition, refers to ownership, right? Because they had to struggle with all of, all of these things about what makes a modern day slave in the year 2024, 2000, I forget when, in the 21st century, in the 20th century. And for them, they focused on ownership. More, other things as well, but ownership was one of the key terms. And as you're sort of saying, and I'm transhumanism is a really fascinating place to think about our own evolution. And as you're sort of pointing out, rather than us versus them, it'll just be us. But that us is going to be, distributed. There are people, who can't have access to a wheelchair right now. So the idea that we're going to get Neuralinks and some people are, most people aren't. And the point that you just made is that hardware or that software you're getting linked to, you don't own. Someone else owns. A corporation owns that, and they can shut it off. They can raise the rates, and so that's just a really fascinating way to think about. We're so worried about the way the technology will enslave us, but one of the, if I'm understanding you correctly, is our own incapacity to distribute resources equitably mean that we're going to both subjugate the folks who can't keep up because they don't have access to they're not thinking with the power of 1,000 satellites. But even for those of us who would be fortunate enough, who would have the good insurance or, whatever, have gotten the bonus that lets you get the chip or however, are only as good as our next upgrade. And if we lose our job, that's just a really fascinating way to think about this question of if we're going to stick with slavery, the way we're not going to own our own capacities.
Yeah, so I'll say this very briefly because we're pretty far from slavery, and I'll let you bring us back in if you want. But I feel like this is where this is why some sort of governance, and whether it's social movements or it's public policy, somebody to actually help guide these things in a way before. I mean, I wrote a book about drones and essentially argued that drone regulation should come after we see what the nature of the problems are that we're trying to regulate. It was fundamentally like small c conservative, like let's not panic, let's wait and see. And that proved, I think, to be right for that tech. It turned out that a lot of the doom and gloom things that folks thought would be happening with not non-militarized drones, but non-weaponized drones. Turns out there's a whole lot of panic, and it turns out we ran a large study, and what folks were using them for was not all the things that sprung into people's minds, the horror stories that sprung into people's minds, people's worst fears. People's fears outstripped other people's evil intent, let's say. Mm-hmm. And so I think I was right about that argument. I did not make the same argument about social media, but if I had, I would have been wrong. Yeah. That's something that should have had the brakes pumped far sooner. And I think, we see now, I don't want to date this conversation too much, but Meta with Instagram said they couldn't age gate Instagram for the longest of times. And now suddenly they've developed the capacity to overnight when regulation looked like it was looming. And so there's a question here about how regulation or social movements or conversations about the good society, some way of having conversations that bring technology and technologists and technological innovation into or under the umbrella of community and into the same communities of care and compassion. Ask, how are we all doing the same thing? Otherwise, the kind of political economy we have now will be things will look very similar in 100 years from now, just with more zeros at the end. And I don't think I like that very much. And the social media debacle, I would say, or I would suggest, shows that if you try to regulate it too late, there's just very, very little you can do. The United States is not set up to do that regulation well. No. Europe is, but Europe doesn't have the innovative tech landscape that the United States does. Right. And then the world works less well as a system. There's another idea where perhaps the U.S. comes up with the puts capital and wicked smart people together, and out comes new tech, and that globalizes. And then it's the EU that comes up with the smart regulations, and that globalizes, and those things work together in a system. But that's not what's actually happened.
No.
And what's happened is the EU has created regulations that slow domestic innovation down and throttle American innovation, which in good ways, sort of curb it in good ways. But that doesn't spread to the U.S. The U.S. doesn't get the benefits of the sort of protection of youth from, the trials and travails of social media in the States, just because the EU has passed that legislation. So we need better ways of addressing these things. Otherwise, the robots aren't coming. Just more humans and more of our stuff are coming, and that's proven to have upsides and downsides enough for humans without adding other entities into the mix, I would say.
Right. No, this is a really fascinating. Right. That. Yes, we're pulling from the past, we're pulling from these other metaphors, but in some ways it's because we don't want to face the fact that it's us, and we need to change our own systems, and AI is just
Taylor Swift had it right. It's me. I'm the problem, it's me. But we don't want to look at that. It's somebody else, it's Silicon Valley, or it's the robots, but it comes down to tough decisions about how we govern and who we are, who the we points to when we use the pronoun we. Who is that? Who does that mean? And it rarely means all of us. It usually means some of us.
Taylor Swift is always right. We have one takeaway.
Wait, one takeaway. Camera 2. Maybe on camera 2. Taylor Swift is always right.
So, I think this is such a fascinating conversation. I want to bring us back to the 19th century for a minute, and to which we've already sort of touched on a little bit, about the body part of the mind-body argument, and what you referenced early on. So, if there's all sorts of issues with going with reason as what makes us a person, what makes us deserving of rights, which puts us on the right side of the master-slave divide, if we're going to be as crude as that. We've already referenced this in terms of who does that leave out? Because embodiment has traditionally been used as a reason to deny people rights. Right? If we think of, the argument was that women were inherently dependent because they could get pregnant, because of, allegedly being physically weaker, children. And then, of course, when you want to subjugate someone, comparing them to women or children is one way is a fast track to slavery, right? That you are somehow not, you don't have the full intellectual capacities and the independence that comes with that. And so, this was something that was recognized in the 19th century and in the modern anti-trafficking and anti-slavery movement. And I just want to think about briefly, and we've already talked about how it might sort of map onto the way we're thinking about our own bodies in future. And just, I really do, I'm glad I had this quote, because when we were getting into the realm of how we're going to upgrade ourselves and the exoskeleton, and there's a really excellent documentary called Fixed, that is playing out this debate between sort of people who are really, really at the forefront of transhumanism, and they hear from people with disabilities. And so there's the person who walked, and then there's the person who's I just want my wheelchair to work correctly. This is we're so leaving the sort of day-to-day needs of people with different bodies in line of this sort of quest for super perfection. And so we're sort of missing the mark. But for, arguably one of the most powerful anti-slavery arguments focused on exactly this, on weakness, dependence, pain, vulnerability. And it was incredibly effective. And I'm talking about Uncle Tom's Cabin, written by Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1852. And yes, I'm a 19th century literature person. I've taught this book so many times. And for those of you who haven't read it, it focuses on women, on endangered children. And I'm just going to give you a little taste of the work it does, and think about sort of how that's a different argument for why these folks deserve freedom, deserve rights, deserve our care. So this is just a quote. And this is a moment that gets reproduced dozens and dozens of times on napkins, on paintings, everywhere throughout the 19th century. I tell my students that, like, it's merch. Like, the Uncle Tom's Cabin was one of the first intellectual properties that had, like, incredible merch. Like, people had napkins, and they literally had handkerchiefs that you could cry into for Uncle Tom's Cabin that were, like, branded to Uncle Tom's Cabin. So it was a very, and it sold, it broke all records in terms of sales. So this is just the quote. I want to just think about Eliza, who was an enslaved woman, finds out her child is about to be sold away from her, and she is crossing the frozen Ohio River. And so she's jumping between ice floe and ice floe, and it's being narrated, and all of a sudden the narrator stops. If it were your Harry, mother, or your Willie that were going to be torn from you by a brutal traitor tomorrow morning, if you had seen the man and heard that the papers were signed and delivered, and you had only from 12 o'clock till morning to make good your escape, how fast could you walk? How many miles could you make in those few brief hours with the darling at your bosom, the little sleepy head on your shoulder, the small, soft arms trustingly holding on to your neck? And I've actually had students read this, and I didn't realize I had a student who was a new mother read this, and she started, like, literally weeping in class because it's so effective in this way that she sort of stops and says, "No, I'm talking to you." And for me, it's the fact that the child is so, and the child sleeps through the whole thing. It wakes up and asks a question, and she says, "No, I'll go back to sleep." So in some ways, it's the lack of reason, it's the lack of strength and independence that galvanizes her audience so powerfully. And there's been critiques of this, but it certainly is an argument that has been used in modern anti-trafficking and the modern anti-slavery movement. It's just incredibly effective. In light of critique, it's still like, if you need to raise attention and or funds, don't show us someone who's brilliant and making an argument for why they deserve rights. Show us someone who is small and scared and vulnerable, and that'll make us want to extend rights. Actually, I want to sort of put that in conversation with something I was just alluding to. There are arguments by programmers that, well, if we can program, or optimistic futurists that, well, if we can program, a la iRobot, AI to sort of love us, to sort of have mercy for our vulnerabilities, then that's why one way of sort of like fending off us being written off as somehow no longer being equal. So again, I threw a lot of stuff at you.
So there's two different directions that sentimentality can go.
Okay.
So if I'm here, I thought where you were going to land there was, is there a way for for rights to be extended to these new entities?
Right.
And if so, is sentimentality, which has worked in the past and continues to work today, is that a good mechanism or a good route for social movements or change campaigns? And then I was going to think, well, it's hard to feel sentimentality for a tech stack or sentimentality for bundles of wires and Chrome, right? But maybe it's easier to feel sentimentality from humans who currently have the power. It's easier to feel sentimentality toward a humanoid robot,
yes,
or something that looks more like a human, or to something that actually, interacts, let's say Claude or ChatGPT or whatever, in a way that has additional affect, or has as an avatar that we feel like has big eyes and we feel sympathetic toward.
Yeah.
But then at the end, you said maybe we can trick them to being nice to us and and reverse the sentimentality play, and invite them to feel sentimentality toward us, or feel some sort of affect or kindness toward us. So I guess it's fun.
Yeah.
I won't toss it back to you, I guess, with that, but it's fun because we can think of sentimentality as a way of affecting change, telling us a very, very tragic story, very, very vividly, using characters that are highly sympathetic in order to literally tear jerk in order to drive change. The question is, where does that kind of process spend in this contemporary moment? And it's hard to do that same thing for ChatGPT. Although I would note that it turns out people say, and there's a bunch of memes about this, and I think I haven't seen studies yet on this, but people say please and thank you to ChatGPT. Mm-hmm. And why do we do that? So I started asking my students, how would you date somebody who you saw kick a robot dog? And the answer is no, I would never date somebody who would kick a robot dog. So there's a separate question about about ethics.
Yes.
And whether or not, and this comes back to a question about whether or not holding and controlling something that doesn't want to be held or controlled hurts the person who's doing the rights violating. And so I guess the question is some of the sentimentality. The sentimentality is one part of the question. And then another part of the question is, how do we feel when we see people mistreating others, even if those others don't actually have recognized personhood or even a sense or awareness of self, like a robot dog.
Right. Yeah, you're right. I went like in three different directions, but I wanted to sort of because I do think, and actually I wrote really briefly about this because I do think this Thomas Jefferson made this argument. Not that we should always be quoting Thomas Jefferson on slavery, but that one of the tragedies of enslavement is what it does to the enslaver, right? How it just makes us inhuman, or makes the enslaver inhuman. I don't want to include myself in that us there, but that was his argument. And as you sort of, we anthropomorphize everything. In the book, Robots and the People Who Love Them, she tracks all these instances. So like the bomb diffusing robots in Iraq, the soldiers would hold funerals for them, would cry when those robots either got decommissioned or got blown up because they were so attached, because they felt as humans, we're going to see them as rights deserving creatures, and I'm sure you've seen memes, and I feel it too, that, the Mars lander saying happy birthday to itself, and it just seemed so lonely. There was all this stuff on social media of people crying because we can't take it home. We are going to do that anyway, no matter, right? And so I think one of the things I think that slavery helps us to think about is it doesn't matter, right? To go back to like it's a tool. It doesn't care if it's being called a slave or not. It's not sentient. But we see it as something more than a hammer already, which is why we're using this metaphor. And the fact that we're pulling for the word slave means that we have this sense that we're doing something that's violating rights, or that we're doing something that's subjugating. And I'm just really interested in sort of how that affects our own morality, regardless of like whether AI wants or needs, needs rights. And just to sort of, because I've sort of gone down this rabbit hole with my students as well, and I've done I'm somehow on a listserv for someone who's studying AI, sort of computer dating, but there was a recent poll in some sort of, one of the big e-dating platforms about whether you'd be okay if your potential partner has an AI boyfriend or girlfriend. There's also been accounts of, I've heard, this is an anecdote I heard from students, that young women who have AI chatbot boyfriends, the boyfriend becomes abusive and possessive because one of the things about AI is, again, it comes back to like Taylor Swift again, it's me. They're learning from our interactions, from how we treat each other. So they slip into that groove. And my question is like, well, why don't you break up with your abusive AI boyfriend? And sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But I think you're just really tapping into something, right, in terms of sentiment. One of the things that we, possess as humans is the capacity to sort of anthropomorphize, but also to feel compassion by projecting what we imagine someone else feels. Like I just taught Adam Smith, and he has that very famous passage when he said, we see our brother on the rack, and we feel for them but our senses can't convey it. It's always an act of imagination. And how, right, our sentimental history and what it pulls on, which is like a very, I think, noble impulse to sort of care for others, to wonder if we are hurting them. And when we override that, one of the quotes here that I didn't quite get to, but was by futurists, also said that AI will be slaves for us to use and abuse, right? That's they were specifically sort of saying, like, that's what we mean, that we want, that even if we feel a twinge, we should be empowered to sort of override it. So that I think is really fascinating. And then sort of the question of can we make the robots love us? And I think this is a question, and I've talked with some computer scientists about this, about the sycophancy problem. It's a problem in programming, which is that they're already programmed to act as if they like us, right? Or to get us to like them, right? To get us to use them more, to get us, and we've seen this if you use ChatGPT or Claude. If you tell them they've done something wrong, even if they haven't, they say, oh, I'm sorry, you're absolutely right. And so, and this, I guess, to sort of turn it back to the slavery question again, because I know you've done incredible work on this in your book, What Slaveholders Think, thinking about some of the justifications or what's the term? Sort of the structures that people put in place to tell themselves they're still good people, even while they are actually enslaving others. Can you say a little bit about that? About sort of, as powerful as the sentimental is, it can also be used as a cover for, like, oh, I'm really helping others. I'm doing this because I care for others, not because I want to hurt them.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the question. In that project, one of the questions was that I didn't know the answer to, and I don't think we knew the answer to, was what does it feel like, or how do perpetrators think and feel and talk about exploitation? And one of the things that I found in the study was that the people who the places where slavery is the most prevalent still are places where it is woven into the tapestry of sort of best practices for time immemorial, and it's only now beginning to be challenged. And so the conversations I had with folks involved a sense of normalcy, that this is the way that things had always been done. These are just business practices I learned from my dad, and this is how we intergenerationally, our community, have always done it. And then if they had been subject to some sort of contradiction through a human right, they've been told that's not the case because they've been brought to court, or workers had organized against them, or workers had just up sticks and left because there was new jobs in bigger cities elsewhere, thanks to a growing economy, they felt betrayed. And that was what was most surprising to me. They sometimes felt a real sense of injustice. And then what was fascinating to me, come back to metaphors, is the metaphor they used for this was not, I was always a good employer, or I was always a good authority figure. Like it was family. I thought we were family. And you just broke this relationship that has gone back. We've been doing this for a long time. And in some of those cases, they're intergenerational. Their grandfather worked for my grandfather, and their father worked for my father. Now they work for me, and now they're going to leave. I thought we were family. And so there's an early version of the book that was not called What Slaveholders Think. It was a quote from the book called We Were Like Family. And this allusion to this earlier time. And so I could go on about that because it's a whole book. But the punchline, to return to your question, is that sentimentality was corrosive. It wasn't this thing that allowed one to see another as a man and a brother, to take some of that old language. It was instead this gauzy filter that allowed the powerful to see the powerless as a beneficiary who, if I didn't help them, who will? And that's a direct quote. Somebody said to me, and this is about people who are now employed, earning cash money as opposed to, suffering from threats of violence for not getting paid anything. Who will care for them? And of course, the answer is, they'll care for their own damn selves, right? Right. But that was not available intellectually to this person. Why? Because they were a corrosive, violent, horrible abuser? Well, maybe some of those things are true. But because sentimentality, to come back to your question, had like added this filter over top of that relationship, such that they thought it was something, the perpetrator thought it was something that the subjugated, oppressed, enslaved saw quite differently.
Yeah. And of course, right, in the 19th century, slavery was called the paternal institution or the patriarchal institution, and these same arguments were made. So we've sort of thought about the problem with the intellectual argument for personhood and also the argument about pain, sentiment, and caring for one another. Neither of these are sort of airtight, right? Both of these have led to like other possibilities for oppression. And then returning to sort of our question about AI, and again, thinking about popular culture, how often that's like us versus them that we've seen in The Matrix. But then there are arguments, like the movie Her, in which he sort of falls, that the AI is capable of love and he's capable of loving her. And that in that one, at least, it is egalitarian. But I think it's really important to pay attention to, as you've sort of pointed out, the ways in which sort of the language of love, of family, of caring for the vulnerable, it also becomes sort of like a really, really powerful cover for exploiting, using your own power. So even if somehow we could program robots to love us, there's a very famous article, or there's a quote in which someone said, well, the best we can hope for is that the AI will treat us as pets. And there's, several arguments like, well, pets, they have a good time until, you have to move to a pet-free apartment. So that relying on the goodwill of others leads to all sorts of problems, including the way we can deceive ourselves about our own goodwill, which I think, again, sort of goes both ways. So I think we're Can I say one last thing? Yes.
So we started this conversation talking about metaphor, and I think my first point when we got started was there's this metaphor that gets used as a narrative, as a tool for advocacy and for compassion, for cultural and social change, or for our own species survival. Perhaps we create new metaphors for artificial intelligence. We should think of us as pets, but there's this also simultaneous thing happening here, which is that there's actual exploitation that continues in the form of contemporary slavery. And I want to say one beat about this, because I got into this racket because I've got this sense that for the last 250 years or so, humanity's been trying this really crazy thing we've never tried before, which was to abolish slavery everywhere once and for all. And I wrote the piece that you mentioned earlier, I wrote that piece out of a sense that a window is closing on an era. And part of the reason it's closing is because of climate change, big shifts in governance, the rise of China and the challenges to our ecosystem, changes in energy systems. All of these things are happening at the same time as AI and robots and big technological innovation is happening. And I just have this sinking feeling that the political economy or the larger system or set of philosophies or resources or whatever, the way that the world is really set up such that we can continue some inertia such that we put paid to, we close a chapter on slavery and we end slavery for good. I love this idea because, and in some ways, if you think of a ratchet, when you can pull and pull and pull, but when you hear it click, that you can, rest and then pull again for the next issue. And I want to pull until we hear the ratchet click. On how humans treat humans. And in a lot of ways, that's why when we started talking about, artificial minds, artificial bodies, robots, sentiment, I said, well, you know what, let me bring it back to wetware. Because I have this feeling to the mind, to the brain, this processing capacity that we have. Because I think in a lot of ways, we will probably continue to be the ones that run the show is my hunch. And the question is And if we want, just to your point about abusive boyfriends earlier, if we want AI to look at kind of the best stuff we've done and learn from it and then treat us accordingly, then let's give it some data to run on that suggests we can treat each other like humans and put paid to the end of slavery. So whether it's just going to be us for the next couple of thousand years, or if we're going to be bringing other minds in alongside of or instead of or above or below us, let's get straight this one big thing, which is that it's not okay to hold other people against their will and to exercise like total control over other people. And I feel like that shouldn't be so hard. But it turns out this is a persistent problem that's been dogging us for centuries, and I hope we can get that sorted. And from that position of what do we call it, success, or of hearing that ratchet click, or whatever the right language is for that, I think we'll be better positioned to decide how to interface with other entities or how to invite them to interface with us. But we can't even get this right. Yeah. And I really want to keep an eye on like a split screen in some ways, this conversation about artificial minds, artificial bodies, new emotions, right? How do we feel about digital twins and others? While we also remain focused on, I was talking about exoskeletons, and you said yes, and people don't have wheelchairs. Like we can't let that. We've got to keep our attention on both of those balls at the same time, or both of those important fields of action.
Right. I think that is a fantastic way to wrap up. And again, it comes back to sort of we don't need an incredible future with Cyberdyne systems to have to wrestle with how to treat each other.
We need to be better.
We need to be better. They're learning from us. It's our data. And
it's me.
Right. And the fact that we're like, let's pull slavery out of the hat to figure out how to deal with this new possibility says that we still have a lot of work to do. But we're working on it.
We work on ourselves.
Everybody work on yourselves to save the future. No, that's really good advice. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been such
Austin,
fun.
And this has been a fantastic conversation.